Next speaker is Juan Loaiza, an independent scholar living in the UK. His interests lie in the crossroads of the philosophy of embodied cognitive science, anthropology, and the practices of South American vernacular music. His research comprises explanatory, descriptive, and creative levels of engagement, seeking to establish links between post-Cartesian, distributed, ecological, inactive approaches to cognition and mind, and the lived experience of the practice of music within the social groups where Juan situates himself. He received a PhD from Queen's University Belfast, a Master in Music Composition at the University of Newcastle upon Teen, and a Bachelor of Engineering in Medellin, Colombia. Juan, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Great, thank you very much. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see also the title bar, but I think that's not a problem.
Okay, but you see the first slide, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, cool, perfect. So yeah, hello, and thank you very much for the invitation. So the title of my presentation is Music and Wellbeing in Ritual Context, and the subtitle is Pushing the Embodied Cognitive Science of Social Dynamics Beyond Weird Research. And I have to say that the way I use presentations is basically to test some ideas, kind of dropping some ideas. So sometimes it might be not fully coherent, but that's what I try to do to motivate a discussion and go through many of the kind of ramifications of what I can say. So I will start with the first part of my title, which is Music and Wellbeing in Ritual Context. So the first thing is that the term well-being in English captures a very broad set of subjective experiences, from being healthy and comfortable to feeling happy, or even the experience of being protected. And recently there has been a lot of research in the psychology of music that tries to understand how people use music to create those subjective feelings of well-being. For example, in the form of mood regulation by listening to certain playlists or certain favorite songs. But what I want to bring here is a slightly different way of presenting this relationship of well-being and music. And what I want to present is a form of social practice where feelings of well-being are intimately interlaced with music within the context of ritualized behavior and traditional forms of knowledge. So let's travel now to the city of Recife in the northeast of Brazil, where there is a form of musical ritual practice called maracatu nação. Maracatu has roots in the music and religious practices of the Africans enslaved and brought across the Atlantic by the Portuguese from the 16th to the 19th century. And for many centuries, until very recently, these practices were banned and persecuted by the government, of course, as a legacy of colonialism and racism. These are practices that are still considered to be kind of backwards, or primitive or superstitious, etc. It's all kind of part of the same racist and colonialist attitude. However, nowadays, maracatu is performed during religious and other festivities associated with the reaffirmation of Afro-Brazilian identity. So during Carnival, going back. So during Carnival, for example, large ensembles of drummers and dancers can be seen parading on the streets, performing continuously for several hours, which is something I have actually done myself. I think this video won't work here, so I will play back the video somewhere else. And do you see my? No, you won't see the screen right now. I will share a different screen now. A different part, and just an example of what maracatu looks like and sounds like.
We're not getting the sound, but we get the picture, the video.
You don't get the sound?
No.
Oh, sorry for that. Yeah, I should have
okay.
I should have tried this, but yeah, it's this is how it looks like.
It's kind of interesting without the sound, actually, because like one of those silent discos.
Anyway, I think you get the idea. Sorry for the missing sound. This is a great soundtrack. Let me just go back to sharing this. Sorry, I'm a bit of a not very good at going through all this. Back again to this. Cool. So you saw, yeah, what happens in on the streets when they parade as these kind of public performances. Now, from the perspective of the participants themselves, maracatu is understood to have highly positive affects and effects, as it is used to make, balance, and maintain the ashe. The philosophical concept of ashe is of Yoruba origin in Nigeria, and is an essential aspect of the Afro-Brazilian religion of Candomblé, as well as in other Afro-diasporic spiritual practices such as Santeria in Cuba. Ashe can be translated into English as life force or energy that can change things or make things happen. Now, initially, for the purpose of this presentation, I would say that Ashe captures the essence of experiences of well-being, mental and physical healing and health through the practice of maracatu as it is experienced by the participants themselves. It is part of the way of understanding how they feel when they participate in this. They usually refer to the ashe and to the creation of and maintenance of ashe. So maracatu is not simply a style of music that can be just simply be consumed to lift one's mood. Rather, it is a ritual form of social bonding through physically intense music making, embedded in the context of Afro-Brazilian religious practices. Moreover, through maracatu, practitioners manage ways of rebalancing and reorganizing the relationships among themselves, revitalizing the symbolic participation of ancestors, and reharmonizing the connection with non-human beings, such as animals, but also ancestral land, spirits, and deities. And as with many religious rituals, interpersonal activities, such as sharing food, intertwined with moments of bodily coordination, which provide the basis for a sense of mutual care. So my first part of the proposal is that I want to say that an approximation to the phenomenology of well-being in maracatu can be best captured with what has been called the sociocentric self. In this understanding of health and well-being, mental disorders, illnesses, and adversity result from disruptions in the balance and reciprocity between persons, family, and community. And I take this from work, very interesting work on cultural psychiatry. Consequently, according to this view, well-being and health or healing interventions are targeted at repairing relationships, reordering an individual's social networks, and reaffirming the person's connectedness to family, community, the land, and ancestors. So more generally, well-being and healing in ritual practice involve an experience of balance that is not limited to the individual nor to the here and now. It's not that you can just optimize that well-being and that healing by just trying to go to the very specific aspects of the here and now. Rather, it corresponds to the maintenance, balance, and repair of relationships. And this is precisely what maracatu does for its practitioners. Okay, so my basic proposal is that maracatu, which is just an example of ritual practice that connects music making and experiences of well-being, presents opportunities for progressing the embodied cognitive science. And if what we want is a science that can understand the nature of cognitive behavior across the human population, then this progress needs to aim well beyond current issues with sampling, basic assumptions, and even ethical and political implications. So as I'll expand shortly, these are what I'm going to show now are the possible targets or opportunities listed according to what I think are increasing levels of challenge. So the first level is the opportunity of improving the sample across the global south, that is beyond weird societies, and I will just come back to what weird means. Level 2 is an opportunity of consolidating current hypotheses about the embodied and enculturated nature of mind and cognition, while addressing the diversity of the human population. Level 3 is the opening up to alternative, non-weird ways of understanding first-person phenomena or understanding experience in general. Level 4 is testing new non-weird grounds that will facilitate new ways of conceptualizing the emergence of life, sentience, and consciousness. And finally, level 5, progressing towards the decolonization of science and philosophy. So each of these levels not only implies the preceding level, but also modifies it. When we reach the level of decolonizing or progressing towards the colonization of science and philosophy, we also will see that we need to modify some of the other levels or the lower levels. Okay, so I will now expand on the first and second levels and arrive at the third level. That's for the rest of my presentation, and sketch some questions about the fourth and fifth levels, opening the discussion and anticipating future work. So let me start with a really big problem of weird research, which is the overrepresentation of samples of population native to Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. These are different dimensions. It doesn't have to be necessarily that the samples just cover all these dimensions. For example, I would say that something like Japan is still a weird sample if you take samples from there, although it's not considered to be Western or fully Western. So between 1988 and 2007, 95% of papers published in main psychological journals were skewed towards European and English-speaking countries. And recently, this figure reduced slightly to 92%. Latin America, which is where Maracatu comes from and where I come from, is only represented in 1% of studies. Now, the problem of weird research has been largely understood as a sampling problem, and thus the proposed solutions have tended towards improving cross-cultural sampling. However, the problem is not just about sampling overrepresentation, it is also a problem of the overrepresentation of basic hypotheses. And I suggest there's a feedback loop between the sampling overrepresentation and the background knowledge overrepresentation, and I might expand later on this in the discussion. So, what are these weird hypotheses and background assumptions? To put it in a very quick way, I suggest, and this is nothing surprising, assumptions are based on the view of humans as individual isolated blobs, like in this picture, which happens to be this kind of 19th century white man, with all sorts of internal mechanisms, holes through which information from the exterior comes in, and an attached body that obeys commands from inside the head. These background assumptions manifest broadly on individualist hypotheses about music, health, well-being, and the place of individual minds within culture. And as a music scholar myself, I witness how the mainstream science of music still treats cognition, music cognition in this respect, as a matter of how sonic information, codified in terms of pitches and durations, comes in through this little man's head holes, and is decodified by some internal mechanisms to produce some experience, for example, of pleasure or well-being. So now I'll use this kind of scorecard and present various alternatives and ask whether they solve the problems of weird research. And as I just mentioned, conventional cognitive science is weird, both in the sampling and the assumptions. So let's see what happens to the rest. So recently, for the population sample problems, in the words of Newson and colleagues, the path is to go wild. This is a new acronym. and not weird. And here wild stands for worldwide population sampling, in situ or outside the laboratory studies based on local values, attitudes and belief systems, which inform bottom-up research design while targeting a diverse demographic spectrum. It's a very nice acronym. So it seems to be that this is already done in some way. So cognitive anthropologists study the cognitive aspects of rituals right there where they take place. They go to fieldworks all over the world. However, the approach is still based on conventional cognitivist background assumptions. And I will show very quickly how. So take, for example, what is called high ordeal rituals. And I have to warn you, I'm going to show some images of people that you may find disturbing, images of high ordeal rituals. So look away if you don't like. So these are extreme rituals that involve painful procedures and the risk of serious injuries or infection. Yet they are performed voluntarily by millions of people around the world. Cognitive anthropologists find an evolutionary explanation in the selection of behaviors that increase social cohesiveness and cooperation. To put it briefly, extreme rituals, according to cognitive anthropologists, are hard to fake. Thus, individuals may be signaling their commitment to cooperate in the group. They communicate, I am not a cheater. And similarly, hard to fake extravagant rituals can improve perception of status. In short, individuals go through ritual pain for social gain. Of course, these accounts of ritual are still largely cognitivist, since preferred explanations appeal to the selection and transmission of cognitive mechanisms that predetermine the unfolding of ritual interactions. So at the end, the researcher is still seeking to explain how the ritual mind works by appealing to a fully deterministic internal machinery well inside the individual, where the top-down processing of information, of cultural meanings, meets bottom-up processing of sensory stimuli. I'm going very quickly through this, but I think you get the idea. So in my view, cognitive anthropologists, although they still do wild sampling, they do it with weird assumptions. Okay, so now the question is whether what I call here post-cognitivist approaches do any better. And the answer is yes. So there are various versions of post-cognitivism, including radical, embodied, enactive, and ecological approaches. And these are branches of what I call today embodied cognitive science more broadly. So for post-cognitivism, knowledge is embodied, enacted, and embedded in coordinated activities. So actions are not so much the external output or result and implementation of an internal mechanism, but the generation of trajectories in the environment. This is the generation of a flow of information, revealing the ecological structures of the relationships between the organism and the environment itself. And also the generation of the ecological information that enables further forms of coordination, for example, in interpersonal coordination. That's, again, a very quick take on what all this means. So overcoming the background assumptions that characterize a weird worldview require getting cognition out of the head. Post-cognitivist approaches have already made really good steps in the right direction by aiming to make higher cognition less intellectualist, not based on mental representations, and grounded on moving bodies, asking instead questions about relationships between brains, bodies, and as Anna said, what brains are bodies, and the social material context. And on the methodological side, many researchers already know very well how to carry out research in situ, for example, in the cockpit, in the hospital ward, or the classroom. And this is the kind of work that has been already captured behind the idea of distributed cognition in the wild. So here's the scorecard. I suggest that post-cognitivism has opportunities for progress in level 1, which is the level of sampling, and level 2, basic assumptions. However, I suggest that some of the consequences of weird assumptions still haunt post-cognitivist approaches. There's still a strong tendency to use a view of agency that privileges the kind of instrumental goal-seeking behavior that can be evaluated through task performance and how that performance is optimized by the agent. So agency is thus modeled on a narrow sample of human motivations and capacities. So the question is, what are other forms of cognition that we don't study enough? So in the words of philosopher Hannah de Geer, we still seem to miss knowing in connection. And here I quote Hannah in full. Our most sophisticated human knowing, I think, lies in how we engage with each other in our relating. Cognitive science and philosophy of mind have largely ignored the ways of knowing at play here. At the same time, the emphasis on discrete, rational knowing to the detriment of engaged human knowing pervades societal practices and institutions, often with harmful effects on people and their relations. There are many reasons why we need a new engaged or even engaging epistemology of human knowing. Okay, so this idea of knowing in connection is central to my proposal and forms the basis of an approach to health and well-being, which I propose can be best studied by looking at ritual practices. I have already advanced in the direction of proposing the primordiality of care in interpersonal relationships in a paper from 2018, published in Adaptive Behavior. In the article, I take up an argument from feminist theory that advocates the relevance of caring practices, and I complement it with an activism. In the paper, I propose that just as the concern of the organism offers a link between living processes and the lived body, the notion of caring offers a link between the self-organized dynamics of social life and the experiences of social participation in collectivities. Okay, so back to Maracatu. From the perspective of participants, in order to make and maintain the axé, one has to commit actively and actively participate in the music, dancing, the offerings, and the appropriate ritualized behaviors. In other words, feelings of well-being, which are aspects of the axé, are not an achievement of mental acts of introspections attributed to the individual. Rather, they are the achievements of complex forms of coordination of all these collective actions. Participants practice a form of knowing in connection that is expressed in appropriate caring actions. So what I propose is that the experience of a healthy, lived body is an achievement of a collective organization of coordination. Okay, now the question is, what kind of organization or coordination I'm talking about? In a paper that I co-authored with Sune Fogh Steffensen and Sara Trasmundi at the Center for Human Interactivity in Denmark, I published, which we published last year, we tried to develop the idea of coordination across multiple temporal ranges. And here we understand coordination as being beyond the narrow timescale of the here and now. Instead, it involves larger processes, not only in brains, but also in the tools and materials in which the body is engaged, as well as the non-local resources, such as norms, institutions, traditions. All these taking place across multiple timescales, and we emphasize the idea of looking at the different timescales of coordination. So in the paper, we offer a framework we call constrained interdependence networks. And this framework provides operational concepts that capture interscale or inter-timescale relationships and how coordination is maintained and repaired across scales. So I'm going very quickly here, just trying to bring these things together. So constrained interdependence networks are based on what I call the Kaufman, Deacon, Monteville, Mosio constrained closure. So I don't have the space here to expand on this, but I want to point to two properties of constrained closure, which I think some of you already know very well. So firstly, larger networks of constraints manifest an emergent and distributed property of self-maintenance. Constraints act on processes that maintain constraints in a circular fashion. And I can expand on this, but this is basically the idea of the constraints closure, the creation of other constraints. So again, I may expand on this later, but what I want to leave up here is the idea that the multi-scale coordination that occurs in something like the rituals of Maracatu is self-maintaining. And I propose a connection between this property of self-maintenance of the network and the observation that social practices also manifest experiential patterns of maintenance, balance, and repair. Patterns of self-maintenance reside at the heart of complex ritual practices, and thus, in my socio-musical example, correspond to the, let's say, the dynamical signature of collectively achieved well-being. As I said earlier, well-being understood as these patterns of maintenance, balance, and repair. And the other property, which is interesting about this constraints closure idea, is that these are networked connections that are not strictly materialistic in the sense of strict transformations of matter and energy. And here I'm going to quote our own paper. So the more nuanced insights offered by the constraints perspective is the crucial distinction between constraint closure and process closure. The latter, unlike the former, is constituted necessarily by a chain of transformation of matter energy that closes onto itself, but not fully, but it's still open to energy from the exterior, whereby the material outputs of one process become inputs for the next one and a closed loop is achieved. Constrained closure, however, does not require a chain of matter energy transformation. It only requires that each localized constraint is maintained by a particular localized process of transformation of matter and energy. If such a local process fails, the associated constraining capacity deteriorates, and a series of failures may propagate in the constrained loop, but not because a pipeline of transformation of energy matter fails, but because a series of constraining actions fail to occur. In short, constrained closure and more generally constrained interdependence, although fully grounded on particular material dynamics, does not constitute a closure of the underlying processes themselves. To put it otherwise, this subtle but crucial distinction allows us to link wildly heterogeneous kinds of processes spread across broad temporal ranges or scales by virtue of the local constraining capacities. For example, we can link chanting vocalizations and drumming and other behaviors occurring in the ritual practice of Maracatu, not by virtue of how matter and energy transformed from one of these processes to the next, but by virtue of how they are organized as a cycle of constraining actions. In other words, the kind of organization or coordination that we need in order to understand ritual practices is one that has a material reality not exhausted by the materiality of chains of transformation of energy and matter, or by this kind of closed material integration. This material reality is that of constraint closure. And now to finish, this last point may have further unforeseen ramifications. So as a final and rather wild speculation, I want to suggest that the materiality of constraint closure makes it possible in principle to have the idea that sentience may also take place at the level of the collective organization itself. That is, in other words, the possibility of conceptualizing collective organization as the site of a form of lived collective body. And I would definitely like to go back to that later. So just to finish this as a final spicy question, is this kind of non-reductive materialism the way of scientifically approaching the African and Afro-diasporic notion of Ashe? But here is where we enter the root and branch idea of decolonizing cognitive science. And I think I will finish with that, and I'm happy to open the discussion right now. But first, okay, so just a kind of a recap. I've gone through all these levels, saying that level 1 and level 2 already kind of on the table. We can progress a little bit on the other levels. And finally, level 5, which is the idea of decolonizing cognitive science, will definitely change what we think of the other levels. Okay, so I'll finish with that. And thank you very much. So I'm not affiliated to any institutions. I have no funding for any of this. So I appreciate your donations, whatever donation you can make. That will make easy for me to continue doing these things as an independent scholar or thinker or music theorist, or however I put it. So yeah, thank you very much.
Stop the recording.